his speech will be evaluated by Stacy Nicely, CL. It is Project 8, be comfortable with visual aids. That's right, visual aids. And his introduction is something like this. When doing speech that involves visual aid, it helps to have your visual aid with you. John Katricak learned that important lesson last week. But fortunately, he is back this week with his visual aid. He apologizes in advance for all the food references. He also apologizes to Janine for finally finding the remote that goes with the projector. His speech is times 5 to 7 minutes. Speech title is Pizza, Nachos, and Pluto's Demotion. Pizza, Nachos, and Pluto's Demotion. John Katricak.
Fellow Toastmasters and our guests, my very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas. My very educated mother just served us nachos. Now, if you grew up like I did, you probably learned this mnemonic device in school, where each letter of the saying, my very educated mother just served us 9 pizzas, incorporates or is also the same letter as the same first letter as each of the planets in order from the sun outward. But if you're growing up in school today, you got this very different, or at least slightly different, mnemonic device. You may notice that the 9 pizzas are now been replaced with nachos. And the reason for that, which you may have heard of before, is that about 8 years ago, Pluto was very controversially demoted as a planet. So, let's talk about Pluto. Not that Pluto. That Pluto. Pluto was discovered in 1930, and at the time was quickly named our 9th planet. But of course, science, technology, all that advances and changes over time. So as things went along, Pluto's candidacy as a planet was looking more and more suspect. And there were 3 main reasons for that. The first is its orbit. It might be hard to tell on this particular angle, but all the first 8 planets rotate around the sun in the same plane, basically the same flat surface. And then here's Pluto cutting across at a diagonal like this. And it's actually, at some points, unfortunately it's not showing up very well, but at some points here, it's even crossing inside of Neptune's orbit, as it did most recently, I believe, at the end of the 20th century. So that was the first knock against Pluto. The second is its size. As you can imagine, and once again, as time goes along, you get more and more objects in the sky being discovered, and many of these were similar sizes to Pluto. So, are they planets as well? And of course, there was debate about that. The tipping point came in 2005 when Eris here was discovered. Eris, as you can see, is actually slightly larger than Pluto. So, the press, of course, was quickly announced the discovery of this 10th planet. Science was not so quick, but it was obvious at this point that something needed to be done. This concept of a planet needed to be clarified. Third knock against Pluto was precedent. In between Mars here, and I'm terrible at drawing circles, but Mars is this one, and Jupiter, there's what's called the asteroid belt. It's made up of asteroids, as it says. Back in the 19th century, technology was only good enough to see in that general area. So people were finding objects in the asteroid belt left and right and naming them planets. But again, once our once science advanced, these objects were reclassified as asteroids, and the definition of planet was tightened then. So the thought was, why couldn't definition of planet be tightened again? So again, Eris was discovered in 2005, and in 2006, the International Astronomical Union met to put out a formal definition of a planet. The first definition they came up with was a classic planet. And a classic planet had three characteristics. It must orbit around the sun, to be counted as a sun. Well, obviously there are planets in other solar systems, but to be counted as a planet in our solar system, we obviously have to orbit around our sun. Second, it must be large enough that it's a sphere by its own gravitational force. What that basically means is that it's a sphere. It's not an oddly shaped rock or anything like that. Third one, this is the important one down here, is that the object must have cleared the neighborhood around its orbit. And what that basically means is that it takes up, there could be other stuff floating in its orbit, but it has to be significantly larger. For example, Pluto only takes up, of all the things that are in Pluto's orbit, Pluto only accounts for about 7% of the mass. The Earth is 99, it's effectively 100%. So with this classic planet definition, the IAU also came up with a second definition, that of a dwarf planet. And the first two points are the same, but it's this third point is the difference. So if you're not clearing the neighborhood, if you're not the biggest object in your orbit by a significant margin, then you're this newly named dwarf planet. So under those definitions, we have these 8 classic planets, which are the first 8 from the sun, basically everyone except Pluto. And then Pluto falls in this second category of dwarf planets. And in this case, actually, Pluto's loss is the gain of this planet here, Ceres. Ceres was one of those objects in the asteroid belt that was 19th century. They found this object, named it a planet. A couple decades later, you're not really a planet. Oh, now you're a dwarf planet. You're somewhere in between. Along with Pluto and Ceres, you got Eris, of course, and Haumea, and Makemake, or Makemake. I couldn't find a pronunciation on that one. These 3 are out with Pluto, out past Neptune. Ceres again in the asteroid belt. And there are many other objects out past Neptune that are being discovered every day and are on the verge of also being named dwarf planets. In conclusion, science, as always, marches on. Pluto, I wouldn't feel bad for Pluto personally. It's not a planet anymore, but it's now with some friends that are more like it. So, and finally, when trying to remember the order of the planets, just remember the nachos. Mr. Toastmaster.